Hello everybody. Today I decided to make a Q&A structured response video to the ActInf guest stream I was featured in, which was about 3 hours long, and I guess to anyone's surprise, or to no surprise to anybody, I wasn't able to go through all the content of the debut publication I am working on. I will also go into nuances of where what this paper is leading into in terms of potential future work to expect a little later on, though, because I want to address questions posed in the live stream chat. So there's two primary questions in that live stream chat that I want to address. Additionally, the host, Daniel himself, has asked me some very specific questions regarding concerns for viewers to be addressed to the viewers, and of course his own concerns. So first, I'm going to get into what he brought up to my attention post stream. So okay. First, he asked, is there any combinations of papers people can investigate more to better understand the content? So let me show you my... Let me show you a little bit of my Trello page, or Trello board. So this is how I keep track of my life. There's a lot of content here, and I'm going to show some key papers that I'm utilizing for my work. So over here I have key papers for mathematical and physical models and key papers. So first we're going to go through, I'm not going to go through each of the papers specifically, but I'll mention a couple papers people can check out and look into to kind of get a better grasp of the content that I presented in the guest stream. And for those of you who are working through the paper, I'll share some I'll recommend some papers to look into. But also, the papers that I'm sharing are in that rushed together, or I guess improper works cited page. For those of you who already checked out the incomplete preprint. So okay, let's take a look here. Alright, so the first paper I want to bring to people's attention that I think everybody should check out, which hopefully should be readable or accessible. Some of the papers might not be, depending on your background, might not be very too accessible in terms of understanding from a layman perspective, or more a less specialized perspective, have you. The first paper would be biological cognition. This goes over, this really makes sense of hierarchical and hierarchical structuring, which again goes into the prioritization as opposed to the selective tuning dynamics of how we pay attention to information, like prioritizing sensations and prioritizing information, which I probably redundantly said in the guest stream. But so you guys want to check this paper out, Just making sure it shows that paper. Okay, so this would be like, this is one of my favorite papers right here. The summary's the abstract is pretty bad, but I promise you the paper is worth reading. It's 68 pages long, so it's pretty long meta-analysis. Please check it out. It really brings together those hierarchical and heterarchical dynamics that I think I made pretty good sense of in the GuestStream. But most importantly, I think that's definitely the first paper that people should be checking out. Next is going to be, I would say, both of Michael Levin's papers here. So I'm going to pop these both. Now, there's a number of Michael Levin papers that that could be utilized in this work, and there's so much more content I can work with from Michael Levin. Michael Levin's work, but so these two papers, these are both Michael Levin, right? The brain is not mental, and emotion, embodied cognition, and artificial intelligence. So this gets into the agential dynamics. So I spoke a lot about how we are constantly engaging with the world around us through the stimuli provoking our engagement, and the dynamics of perception, action, and anticipation. So this gets this gets into that from a cellular bottom-up level more so. At least from my perspective, it gave me that impression. But I guess other people will think differently. But it will definitely give you definitely give you a good impression of how the top down and the bottom up are coming, the dynamics pieced together in terms of the cognitive load as opposed to metabolic load, as I mentioned. So these two papers, definitely check those two papers out. Those are by Michael Levin. Let's see, there's a couple other papers here. Let me just pop these open before I say anything else. Because I know one of these papers is going to be the eigenforms paper, right? I'm talking to myself ever so slightly here, so bear with me. I didn't really get a chance to talk about assembly theory, which I'll talk about in a moment in terms of another question. Another point Daniel brought up was going over modeling or coding examples that will provide motivation towards the content presented. So Lee Cronin and friends published a more recent paper, which I didn't get a chance to read yet, but a lot of the motivation for assembly theory, which I'll get into momentarily, it is inspired by this paper. So I definitely highly recommend even though I didn't really cover it much, and I didn't really cover it in the GuestStream, and I'm probably going to in the rough draft, in a final draft, one of the final drafts of the publication effort, definitely going to pay some attention to assembly theory in the modeling section. So keep an eye out for an updated preprint. So I highly recommend reading this paper. So I'm going to keep that open. Oh, here's another Michael Levin paper, Synthetic Morphology. Again, getting into agential materials. Okay. Which paper was this? This paper didn't, now this is a pretty nice paper in terms of the modeling and the methodology approach, not so great, but there's a lot of inspiration from this paper in terms of interagent dynamics, which I'll spend more time getting into today because the questions pertaining to, in the live chat brought up regarding the content coverage, really have to do with that. I didn't have much time left to cover as much of the rest of the content in enough comprehensive detail. So this might, hopefully, watch this in piecemeal. It might go on for about 2 hours covering the rest of the content I want to cover, because I'm going to deal with general questions first, and I'm going to get right to covering the rest of the content that I didn't get to cover enough detail to address the questions from the live stream audience. So here's now, okay, this paper is worded pretty well, like I said, but there's problems with the modeling and methodology approach. So just keep that in mind. All right. Perception as something we do. And now, in terms of thinking about perception, the PAP-cycle, perception, action, priors, this paper is very inspirational, by Eric Meehan, probably not pronouncing the last name right. Highly recommend this paper. Please check it out. It came out in 2016, so it's a little bit dated, but perception is something we do. It's a great paper. Doesn't have much going on with it in terms of modeling, but lots of good content coverage in that paper. Very inspirational. Okay. Let's see. Anything else here? Before, because there's a couple more papers I'm probably going to recommend before I get into the other concerns brought up by Daniel. Okay, I already went over that. The concept of the Bolstein culture, you know what? I butchered the pronunciation of that, so I'm not going to say it again. But this commentary piece is very good by Sasha Fink. And actually, Thomas Metzinger is the brain behind this conceptualization. And this gets more into the interagent dynamics portion of the paper, which again I didn't really get to really cover much in good detail. So I'll leave this open to make reference to it as needed. I might not need to make reference to this, but this is a great commentary article, and it's very short, so it's a quick read. It shouldn't take you more than maybe 20 minutes at most, if it takes you that long, maybe half an hour to read. So it's a great paper in terms of inspiration for interagent dynamics, so I highly recommend that. Alright. Okay. Now we're going to get into the modeling focused papers, because there's a couple papers I want to bring up here. Let this load. Give me a moment here. Where is it? Okay. Here it is. And oh yeah, well, I already went over the agential systems conceptualization in terms of single agent systems, multi-agent systems. Hopefully Michael Levin's work gives you a good idea of what's going on there. I will make another paper recommendation as well to go with that, but bear with me here. I just want to make sure I got everything. Alright, so I went over reality being an interface. This paper published by Hoffman, Prakash, and Pretner. I think I accidentally said, oh yeah, Chris Fields is in it too. Okay, yeah, so Chris Fields, Hoffman, Prakash, Pretner. Highly recommend this paper. I mean, it's a little bit dated, but I think it really pieces the general conceptualization of what it means for reality to be an interface and the boundedness of organisms with environment, and talking about the dynamics of how organisms are coupled to their environment in terms of like being existentially embedded in their environment. This provides a lot of motivation. I wouldn't say that this paper implies about the existential embeddedness of agents in an environment, but that's where I kind of extend. I make an extension. I extend the base of boundaries between agents and environments as proposed in this paper, but also there's other papers that talk about this idea of existential boundedness. But primarily, I will say this is the paper you want to read for that. Michael Levin's papers on agential systems that I've already brought up, those 3 papers, that they should imply and explicitly denote this idea of organism, of how agents are part of an environment and they're bounded. They have a boundedness as well, and the environment has constrains the agents. So definitely check out those Michael Levin papers that I brought up. So I highly recommend those as well. Okay. Quantum-inspired cognitive agents. Now, I will say I kind of disagree with the premise about quantumness being prevalent in cognitive functioning, but what I will say is there's a lot of interesting inspiration in this specific paper here that goes hand in hand with this idea of multi-agent systems and how our cognitive capacities is a multi-agent system itself, like how the top-down dynamics of cognitive function is itself a multi-agent system, since no one region of the brain is doing a particular function. We have this lateral, distributed, parallel processing of sensations into information and prioritization and selecting out sensations and information, right? So this paper is very inspirational. There's problems with the modeling in the paper. It's very rigorous on the math, but I think it does a nice generalization in terms of where the paper goes and what future works can bring about. I'm not going to waste time criticizing the paper, but this paper in particular, in terms of having more motivated understanding of agential systems, especially understanding the brain itself as a multi-agent system. This paper is brilliant for that, so check this paper out, Quantum-Inspired Cognitive Agents. And lastly, I spent a little bit of time, granted, I was able to comprehensively go over the indeterminacy or uncertainty dynamics regarding agency. This paper's pretty good. I wish there was... Well, can't say I wish there was. There are other papers that I haven't taken a better look at, but this paper certainly caught my eye. It came out in... what's the date here? 2022, I suppose. Right, 2022? Okay, well... so it's not that old. So this is, in terms of uncertainty dynamics, I think that this paper does touch on interpretive and functional indeterminacy that we went over, problems with interpretation as opposed to problems with action. So in terms of perceiving stimulus versus acting on the stimulus, right? Problems with you know, like the uncertain moments of perceiving as opposed to acting. So this paper has a lot of motivation towards that, so I highly recommend it. A computational lens on the transdiagnostic nature of intolerance of uncertainty. So check that out. Other papers, I think so far I think that's good enough. If there's any follow-up, I might make another Q&A video, but how are we on time here? Because I think we're going to go on for a bit. 22 minutes, wow, okay. Alright, so those are the papers I recommend. So I have one model that's sort of fleshed out that I'll go over, that where I will say the assembly theory paper comes to mind. Maybe a good number of people watching this are familiar with Lee Cronin's assembly theory. I think it's gotten a lot of press in the academic community, at least as well in the machine learning community. I'm not so sure about like overall tech affiliated communities, like how many people have been exposed to assembly theory. So let's take a look at the model. Let me load that. And what I'm showing you is if you already looked at the preprint, this is part of the attachments of the part of the figures that go with the preprint, but I didn't have a chance to really get into it. So let's get into it. Alright, before we look at that model. So, okay, well, at the very beginning of the stream, I introduced reinforcement learning behavior as opposed to maladaptive learning behavior. And the motivation behind the model here regarding the deriving compulsive behavior has to do with, if we recall that habits are these persistent compositions of behaviors, right? In terms of that, it's this persistent capacity to regulate how we engage with the world around us, right? And try to survive and adapt, and deal with circumstances, right? So that's the motivation behind the nature of habits, and that habits can be they can provide a way for agents to optimize fitness, or in the terms of reinforcing or being reinforcement behavior based or reinforcement learning based. Otherwise, habits would work counterintuitively as opposed instead of constructively in the reinforcement sense. So on the one hand, you have reinforcement based learning behaviors, which are a constructive way or constructive modes of behavior that guide the fitness of the organism to be in the most optimal sense moment by moment, right? Because we know that the fitness of agents in terms of thinking about at least biological organisms as agents degrades over time due to cellular senescence. So in dealing with the suboptimality of fitness, how can we optimize that as best as possible over time, or most reasonably? We think of reinforcement learning behavior. On the other hand, you have maladaptive learning, right? And maladaptive learning, that's counterintuitive to fitness. It's penalizing fitness. Now we have this legend here. The green represents the reinforcement learning, the red represents the maladaptive, and the blue is the impulsive, and the turquoise is the compulsive behavior. So what I came up with here is an assembly model of how we can have compositions of behaviors that amalgamate to represent a what would be overall reinforcement-based behavior or a maladaptive-based behavior, right? And we mentioned too that behaviors can transition from reinforcement learning to maladaptive, or rather, you also have a spectrum of behaviors that lean towards being reinforcement learning based as opposed to maladaptive learning based. So no one behavior is fully maladaptive or fully reinforcement learning in the most realistic sense here. Like we're dealing with a spectrum where each amalgamation of behaviors that represents reinforcement as opposed to maladaptive, is on a spectrum. And at one end of the spectrum, you have reinforcement learning. On the other end of the spectrum, you have maladaptive learning. So, alright, so this is the simplified model in terms of coming up with an assembly theory approach to deriving habits or habit-forming behaviors, right? So we have this simplistic model here where we have instincts, and then amalgamations of instincts lead to compulses, like impulsive behaviors are like instinctual. So we're going to consider the impulses to be instinctual, while the compulses are compulsive behaviors, which is amalgamation of impulsive behaviors, would either branch out to be reinforcement-based or maladaptive-based, or really a combination thereof on a spectrum, right? So we go from this model to we go from this simplified model to the overall assembly model. So we have an amalgamation of behaviors that assemble or map to some representation that is a reinforcement learning based behavior as opposed to a maladaptive learning based behavior, right? So this is really more like I guess you could call it it needs I guess I would say it needs a little bit more work, but this is sort of like an assembly model based spectral graph that I came up with that shows like how we could take an amalgamation of a combinatorial or combination of behaviors that kind of map together to represent a reinforcement-based behavior or maladaptive-based behavior, right? And we could think of how, there's certain traits of behaviors that lands the habit, that puts certain habits on a spectrum, right, of being reinforcement learning-based as opposed to maladaptive learning-based. So that's the whole idea behind the assembly theory model here, is that we have an amalgamation of behaviors that make up a particular habit or a composition of habits, right? Because habits can be compositional as well. We can and those habits can be reinforcement based or maladaptive, right? So it either complements fitness, it optimizes fitness, or it penalizes fitness. So that's what habits do. So either the agent's persistent engagement with their environment and themselves, intrinsically, like as the agent is dealing with stimulus as opposed to interacting with the environment extrinsically, right? As the agent is engaged with the intrinsic and extrinsic dynamics thereof of engaging with itself and the environment, the way it does that is reinforcement based or maladaptive based in a persistent manner, right? Where we consider this persistent engagement to be habitual. All right. So that's this so that's really the one model I have that's really kind of fleshed out. I'm going to go over it again and add some formality to it in the modeling section. But I don't want to waste since I haven't completed the modeling section. I don't want to waste too much time here with that. The reason why I haven't gotten much more work done with models is that I had to rewrite what I thought I had at least a half complete paper, so this almost half complete paper last year. It turns out after some criticism towards the end of last year, I had to reapproach where I was going with the publication effort, and I wrote a whole new outline at the beginning of the year, and this since January, the past number of months since the beginning of the year has been purely writing intensive because I basically rewrote. I salvaged 19 pages of what I wrote last year, which is about 26 pages long. So the paper at the point that I wrote it, before I decided to rewrite the paper, was 26 pages long. So I started from scratch this year, so that's why I don't have more models fully fleshed out. I do have outlines for models, but I don't have those outlines up with the preprint. So I don't want to leak out too much information right now because I don't have those documents available along with the official publication preprint document. So which is unfinished, but at least it's up there. So just for those who are wondering, like, what's going on with the modeling, I had to rewrite what I thought I had was more than half complete paper, but it's been like just months of intensive, like non-stop intensive writing since the beginning of the year, and I spent about a week and a half coming up with a whole new outline, and then from the beginning of the year, and then it's been writing intensive from there. So I haven't had a chance to really work fully flesh out more models than this, unfortunately, for those wondering. But I will definitely spend a couple months this year wrapping up the rough draft of the publication to make sure I got the models fleshed out, and hopefully I'll be able to do a part 2 presentation to go over the rest of the body of the paper and the modeling, because I'd love to do that, but not trying to come up with excuses, but I just had to take a big step back, or a few steps back, if you would call it that, and basically rewrite a whole paper. from scratch, which was originally 26 pages long, which I salvaged 19 pages of for the technology intervention focused paper, which would be the next paper in the series of papers I'm focused on here, this debut paper, which is more of an overview paper on the nature of habits and adaptive learning. So hopefully that's enough explanation for that. So I went over paper recommendations. I went over this model, this assembly theory model, which I think is pretty well fleshed out, but it's not complete because there's not really much formal rigor here introduced other than a figure and a spectral graph, even though it might be a bastardized spectral graph of sorts, but it's still, in a sense, I suppose, a spectral graph. But anyway, all right. I believe I addressed Daniel's questions. Just double checking. Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah. All right. So let's take a look here. So the general questions from the live chat feed that were given by Michael Lennon. I have two questions here. The first question is, how would I contrast the modification of individual habits versus habits between paired individuals versus habits of clusters of individuals? The second question is, how might I describe how a moment of novel individual insight becomes a collective behavior change? So these two questions, I think, could be properly addressed by comprehensively going over the interagent dynamics section that I basically rushed through over the live stream. So to no surprise, I understand where he's coming from, because I didn't really get to I can see where Michael's coming from, because I didn't really get a chance to comprehensively go over what would enough insights that motivate how does the behavior of one agent as opposed to cooperating group of agents impact one another, right? So, or how does one agent function as opposed to a group of agents, right? Or what's the dynamic happening here? So let's go over. Let's start from where I'm also going to go over the maladaptive learning section a bit more too, because I think that some good insights can be leveraged from. There was a couple of things I wanted to elaborate on a bit more in terms of maladaptive learning. Okay. Now, first off, it doesn't start this section. Preserving viability. We're going to talk a bit about preserving viability here, because that's what's going to lead into the dynamics of why is cooperation not only a requirement, but how does it optimize fitness between agents, which is necessary for the survival of a whole species of agents. So and for those of you, I'm hoping people watching this, of course, I've watched the first video because I'm not going to waste too much time doing a whole long overview. I think I did a nice short overview of in terms of revisiting reinforcement learning as opposed to maladaptive learning behavior when I went over the assembly theory model. But for those of you who want a more comprehensive understanding of the content, please check out the initial 3-hour live stream if you're lost here on out. So I think looking at that content should make up for whatever questions you may have that's already elaborated in the GuestStream. So, okay. So this idea of preserving viability, when we think about when I talked about cognitive load as opposed to metabolic load, and being how we're constantly engaging with stimuli, right? When we remember the PAP-cycle, perception, action, priors, right? And perception as the initial interpretation, or interpretation with respect to anticipation, right? To predict what to do, like how to interpret and how to react going forward, right? So action deals with the response. Anticipation deals with, okay, we have a history of perceiving and acting. So obviously being able to guide our behavior and adapt is not perfect, right? Because we're constantly being bombarded with stimuli, and the stimuli could, we have to generalize how to make sense of the stimuli, right? So we have sensations, like we amalgamate these sensations from being exposed to stimuli. And on the one hand, we might be able to notice patterns in ways we generalize the sensations, and on the other hand, we might be deceived, or there might be some error-proneness in being able to recognize how we adapt to circumstances, right, and dealing with fitness trade-offs in that sense. So on the one hand, how we deal with stimuli could be misleading based on the constraints in our environment and how we're able to engage with the stimuli due to the constraints presented to us as agents, right? We're thinking, or just agents, not just us as agents, but just other human capable agents or general intelligent agents. Like this paper is largely focused on general intelligent agents, or thinking about human behavior rather. That's what this publication effort is focused towards, even though I do pay mind to other biological organisms as agents, like to compare human behavior. And I do spend a bit of time talking about what makes humans different as opposed to other organisms. And that might not be necessary to address the questions that Michael mentioned, but we'll step through what preserving viability means, and then we'll move forward to like how agents effectively cooperate with each other to preserve each other's agency, right? Because that's pretty important. So this optimal ebb and flow of guiding our capacity to anticipate has to do with preserving viability, right? Like how we are able to effectively predict and guide our fitness with respect to circumstances, right? That has to do with preserving viability, right? Like making viable behaving in a viable manner over time and preserving our agency based on the decisions that we make based that are reflective of perception, action, and anticipation, or that the PAP-cycle dynamic, right? And so, this has to do with the entire dynamic, right? Like how we perceive the world around us, and then how we respond to it, and then keeping a history, like anticipating, okay, well, how do I perceive and act on future states of the world around me, and especially thinking intrinsically and extrinsically about, my internal state, bodily states, like also trying to interpret the world around me as well. Like, okay, how do I engage properly, right? This has everything to do with preserving viability. I might get back to this later. I think I do. Let me see if there's anything for me to pick out from this specific section, because I know I go into better detail into the actual section that really goes into cooperation of agents. So clearly, engaging with each other in a diplomatically optimal manner, and where we recognize each other's agency and we try to come to an acknowledgement of trade-offs to engage with each other, right? Because that not only is that going to preserve my fitness, but that's going to preserve your fitness, and in the long run, or the short run as well, depending on how circumstances play out, and how, if we're speaking of arbitrary agents, not just how I'm engaging with the world around me and how other people are engaging with me, we think about, due to uncertainties in the environment, and if the agents were not to engage with each other, what would happen, as a result of that? Well, the other agents, they might have specializations or modes of engaging with the environment that not only complement their fitness in a way, but could additionally be an additional complement to my fitness if I choose to engage with them. And shortly we're going to come to a whole, I think, pretty comprehensive understanding of why agents cooperating with each other, not just coordinating with each other, but cooperating with each other is crucial for how humans as agents have been able to progress to modern society, the way modern society functions, because none of the ways in which we engage with the world around us, and the technology or the tools even that we use due to technological advances and being able to manufacture certain goods and services the way we do, nonetheless even provide goods and services, none of this would be possible if we did not recognize each other's agency to a certain degree and decided, okay, let's figure out how we can work together by recognizing each other's agency and acting on that recognition of agency, and then trying to figure out trade-offs in terms of, okay, how do I perceive, act, and anticipate how to cooperate with fellow agents that choose to do choose to act in good faith, or in a sense where they acknowledge, well, the best they can do is try to cooperate with me to optimize their circumstances. Otherwise, their circumstances, much like mine, if I don't cooperate with them, will get worse, right? So that's the idea of, thinking of myself as an agent, engaging with another, because I am an agent. If I choose not to engage with another agent, that in a means that penalizes me, well, then I'm penalizing my own fitness, right? I'm acting maladaptively. So in order to reinforce my own fitness, and it came down to it that I had to cooperate in order to reinforce, then I have to cooperate, right? And that's the idea here with preserving viability, is it not only has to do, when we think about how human society got to where it is, and how we effectively engage with our environment, is due to the interagent cooperation dynamics that have been facilitated to get us to modern society, right? That enables the way that human beings as agents are able to engage with each other in the modern world, as opposed to way back in the past when we had tribal societies and what have you, right? Like, people were much less cooperative back then as they are now. Think about human beings as agents. And we'll shortly get into what's interesting about us, about what separates humans from other organisms, which I think kind of tops off the two questions that Michael asked. But really, I think it's hard to think about how we as individual humans engaging with our environment as opposed to collectively. It's really hard to separate ourselves from the rest of society, because maybe we wouldn't, a lot of us wouldn't exist if enough of us didn't cooperate for as long as we did for society to get as far as it has, right? So it's sort of an interesting existential dilemma to think about. It's like, okay, well, like, how do you contrast the modification of individual habits as opposed to regarding paired individuals as opposed to clusters of individuals, right? And really, when we're thinking about groups, we're not only thinking about pairs, but the extension of pairings into clusters. But to really start it off, we think about the dynamics of engaging with an agent to be we associate the dynamics of engagement in pairs, where we can take coordinated groups as pairs, and we can talk about the engagements within groups of agents associated with a group, and how they're engaging with each other as pairs as well. But really, specifically with humans, like when we're thinking about our behavior, because in the most relatable sense, we can realistically only talk about human behavior in terms of thinking about, okay, how do individuals as opposed to paired individuals versus clusters of individuals, how do we consider like how habits can change over time for each agent that's engaging with one another, right? Or if they choose to not engage with each other. I think in the most primitive sense, we can speak of what I denote as lesser agents when we think of other biological organisms, right? That they will act more primitively, and they wouldn't, because of the more simplistic function they have of their role in the environment. They're only able to adapt in certain ways or modify their habits in certain ways, circumstantially. When you think about predator-prey dynamics of, you know, rodents or birds of prey. You know, think about like a squirrel or a chipmunk or what have you, or a mouse or a rat versus like an owl or a hawk, right? And just, you know, how does how does the rodent avoid the prey? You know, how does the prey avoid the predator, or like optimize staying alive as opposed to being as opposed to being you know, the predator getting its prey. So in terms of like, if we think about hostility-based dynamics, obviously one agent is going to get a fitness advantage over another agent. Otherwise, I would say the agent that doesn't clearly have a fitness advantage has to be clever and figure out a way to engage with its environment. So like a rodent trying to you know, like a mouse trying to avoid an owl or a hawk, or, you know, any other rodent. You know, if they want to avoid getting snatched by the hawk, right? They have to figure out how they're going to hide in the foliage, right? If there's like if there's a bush or there's something around them that they could use as leverage to hide from the predator that has a fitness advantage, like a clear fitness advantage, in the sense that, like, if the mouse or the chipmunk or the squirrel doesn't use its environment to its advantage, if it's not clever enough, it's just going to get it, you know, the predator is just going to have its way. So in terms of modification of individual habits, you know, thinking about this scenario, I would say that, you know, the rodent has to figure out how to take advantage of its environment and hide from the predator, right? And also be able to optimize, you know, it has to be able to you know, to eat food, right, to sustain itself. It has, you know, it has to regulate its integrity while avoiding the predator. So in that sense, like, otherwise, you know, it could incur fitness penalties by, you know, if there's too many constraints, then, like, there's not enough food available for the rodent, and the predator is staking out the rodent, right? That could be like a pretty bad situation for the rodent, right? Because then that's more of a fitness advantage for the hawk, right? Because the hawk the hawk might realize that there's not much food available, there's a lot of food scarcity for the rodent, and it could just trap the rodent in the corner, and realistically, unless the rodent waits long enough to get the hawk, you know, if the mouse or the squirrel waits long enough, so the hawk decides to leave and go find another opportunity, you know, that's where, you know, the hawk's going to have a lot more fitness leverage unless it loses its patience and decides it's not going to wait for the squirrel or the mouse to leave itself open and give the hawk a chance to have a snack, to feast on it, right? You know, where the hawk just wins, you know, that, you know, in that circumstance, that, you know, the rodent just totally penalized, you know, totally annihilated, right? Like, you know, totally fitness penalized to the max, right? Like, the only way out of that situation is for the hawk to just become, you know, either the hawk is not really paying much attention, and there's enough constraint, there's enough leverage for the rodent, you know, for the mouse or the squirrel or whatever, to leverage its environment and escape the circumstance of being food, being a meal, being annihilated. You know, in the worst case, the rodent is in a corner somewhere, right? Like, it's stuck in a hole in the ground or something, right? And there's no food, there's nothing else there. and the hawk is just waiting, right? Unless there's a way for the rodent to dig a hole through the ground to go somewhere else, like it's just stuck there and it has to wait. It has to hope that the hawk becomes impatient, and then it's gonna look. The hawk's gonna just look for another opportunity. So that's I think that's a good example outside of like human behavior. I mean, dealing with human behavior, I mean, people acting hostile to each other, that's an opportunity where both agents, both parties of agents, like we consider pairs of agents to be acting in bad faith, right? Like they're acting in a hostile manner, and so that potentially penalizes the fitness of both agents involved, right? We think about humans as agents. But, I mean, realistically, humans as agents, they have the level of awareness, or rather autonomy, they have the degrees of autonomy to really try and work together and cooperate and get the most out of that. Because one agent might have certain capacities that the other doesn't have, and the other one vice versa, and they can complement each other, right? Like one agent might have certain, might be able to cook, the other one might be able to, let's think of hunter-gatherer example. Like one might be able to cook, another might be able to forage and hunt, right? So like they coexist, they cooperate in a fashion where it's okay, I hunt for food, you prepare the food, sort of thing, right? Or I forage and you hunt, right? And that's a very simplistic example. I mean, another example is like think about a workplace, right? You have a team of developers working together on a project, right? That's another simplified example of like thinking about agents cooperating together as opposed to individually acting, right? I mean, in a hostile situation among agents, I guess you could say they're individually acting and they're not really cooperating with each other. But in most cases, humans as agents are really going to try to maximize on cooperating with each other in pairs, right, and facilitating how they persistently engage with each other and their environment. Realistically, that's generally what's going to happen. So you're going to usually consider, in terms of human behavior, because we're social animals. We're not, obviously that's an umbrella term, social animals, but we're very, humans are highly social. We rely on engaging and cooperating with each other. But anyway. Okay, so let's go into section 2.5. Alright, so let's talk about the difference between coordination and cooperation, right? I think that's pretty important. Give me 1 second. Give me 1 second here. Okay. So the way I defined coordination here is I talked a lot about guided random search in terms of optimizing fitness, right? When I talked about homeostatic regulation or regulation of metabolic and cognitive functioning, right? Like keeping it stable enough for the agent to, keep engaging with its surrounding environment and be able to optimize trade-offs over time for fitness leverage. One second here. So I brought up Celia Hayes and in terms of her work on imitation learning. So coordination, I believe as I defined it here, because I'm looking for an exact definition. That's why I'm not necessarily stuttering, but I just want to make sure that the way I'm explaining it is verbatim. So, so let's say that agents are just engaging with each other in some arbitrary fashion, and it doesn't matter really the outcome of the engagement. It's an interaction. The baseline interaction between agents is considered coordination, while cooperation is the result of how agents are engaging with each other, for better or worse. So cooperation could there could be hostile cooperation, or there could be the cooperation can result in the way where agents are engaging with each other maladaptively, or they're engaging with each other in a means that is reinforcement learning based. So I know that's the way I worded it here, but I can't find the exact part of the paper. So, on the one hand, any interaction between agents is some coordinated effort between them. And that coordinated effort can result in some mode of cooperation, which would be either reinforcement-based or maladaptive base for the group of agents engaging with each other, in which they are preserving viability of each other's fitness. So that's the idea here of like coordination and cooperation. So this idea of collective behavior, which we're getting to now, I think I answered Michael's first question. Novel insight. Okay. How might I describe how a moment of novel individual insight becomes a collective behavior change? So, in dealing with so novel insight has to do with dealing with uncertainty, right? So navigating the unknown, right? Right, well, I guess we could take the hawk, we could take the rodent and the hawk, like, as really the most primitive example, right? Like the squirrel, the mouse, whatever, the hawk or the owl. If like we want to make it seem like, okay, well, what's an example of addressing this outside of human behavior, right? Or well, let's say like there's two or three squirrels that are trying to evade one or two hawks, right? Like, and the hawks, maybe they're working together to get food, right? They're working together to target these squirrels, right? Some small group of squirrels, right? And these squirrels, they have to figure out how to in a way, engage with their environment, dealing with the circumstances that they feel uncomfortable with, right? Because they're being sought after by a predator, so they might feel like they're unsure of what to do, so they're going to explore their environment. They're going to try and find some place to hide, and that's the goal, And the novelty here is figuring out where to hide and how to avoid being prey. So that's really the novelty exploration aspect here. And if the group of squirrels can avoid the hawk or the hawks coordinating with each other, then that's in their benefit, right? They're cooperating with each other to a collective degree, which is more simplistic than how humans would cooperate with each other in a collective fashion. But in the novel sense, you have to figure out, because they're not sure how they're gonna, the group of squirrels at this point is kind of unsure of how they're gonna escape the hawk or the hawks. It might be one hawk or it might be more than one hawk, right? It might be two hawks. Until they escape the hawks, they're in a situation of uncertainty where they got to figure out how to escape being prey. And that's the novelty exploration aspect. That's the moment of novel insight, is how they're going to find themselves not being food to the hawks. Now that's a very simplistic example. Okay, now we go from that to human behavior. And I think with human behavior we can be less extreme, but really what's interesting about human behavior in a collective sense is we think about this idea of imitation learning. What makes humans different? And I sort of went over this in the initial GuestStream, but we have this capacity of utilizing language systems because our brains evolved to be able to use language, to incorporate and augment language over time. And Celia Hayes makes this case, which is distinct, I guess you could call it a cultural selective process, right? Because language is conveyed between a group. So you have a culture, you have a group, you have a culture, and basically what's happening with the development of language over time is that there's iterations of there's generations of humans after humans over time, right? With civilization getting to modern era times to where it is, right? We have a number of ancestors from many, many years ago that enabled the progression of human society, because humans over time, we as humans, we use the sophisticated language structuring to take generalization of information and pass it down iteratively over time. Each generation of humans is another instance of humanity acting collectively to pass down information, right? And so there's this just want to make sure I get this right here. So there's this generational transference of concepts. So concepts are informational mappings of ways we abstract our environment and our understanding of our environment, how we perceptually engage and interpret our environment in order to act on it and predict how are we going to perceive and act on it in future moments. And this idea of concepts is being able to distinguish different aspects of our environment, our intrinsic nature, and how we extrinsically engage with our environment. And additionally, there's this idea of mimetic adaptation, which I might have went over a little bit in the GuestStream. But the whole idea is if a large enough group of humans cooperate together, then there's the potential for these groups to transfer these concepts. And if the conceptualization or the concepts, if the conceptualization of information is consistent enough to optimize fitness, if it's consistent enough for enough generations of humans to optimize for fitness, then those concepts become what I call generalized knowledge. So you go from generalized information, prioritizing information, to prioritizing knowledge. And what makes information different from knowledge is you go from sensations, then you have patterns of sensations. Those patterns of sensations that are selected out become information. That information can then get some conceptual mapping to our cognitive, our cognitive, the way we process the world around us, cognitively perceive, act, and anticipate, deals with these conceptual, prioritizing sensations as information, but then we prioritize that information as some conceptual mapping where we abstract that, we have some abstract depiction of that information, and this is reinforced by language. Language enables us to make associations with that information, to develop abstract associations, like this capacity of abstract exploration and passing on of information becomes, this is conceptual, right? Like there's certain aspects of reality that we recognize because enough of us have cooperated, enough of us working together have decided to work on developing an abstract mapping of reality utilizing language, right? And and this utilization of language is really what separates humans from animals, because there aren't, we're the realistically, like, we're the only existing agents capable of utilizing the capacity to cooperate and pass down information to such a precise iterative degree that enables us to have a mapping of knowledge that guides how we optimize as even larger groups, how we optimize fitness in larger groups, right? So we go from smaller groups of humans from the distant past to now there's even larger, right? You have these whole populations of nation states now in modern era, right? So and that's all due to this capacity of mimetic adaptation, where parental guidance, our parents pass down information to us. They teach it. We go to school, right? We have these systems, like the school system, right? But even before there was an actual school system as it is now, that enabled the passing down of information to have a sufficiently cooperative population. One of the big setbacks here, though, I will say, is it takes about most people finishing public education in the United States, for example, they're about 17, 18 years old. Some people 15, 16. It's very unordinary to be younger than 15 or 16 and going to, being in a higher education environment, right? It takes about up till your late teenage years to have enough conceptual understanding of the world around you to even be able to more intuitively engage with the rest of society in a productive fashion, because you have to spend at most 17 and a half years of your life in a learning environment, right? In a primitively fundamental learning environment, right? Where you have to be brought up in. It takes 17 and a half years on average for people in the United States, at the very least, right? Like 17 and a half to 18 years, right? To be properly socialized, to become recognized as functioning adults that are responsible for conducting themselves and engaging in a sufficiently productive fashion with the rest of society, right? One of the benefits lesser agents have that we don't have is that it doesn't take them as long to get go through child rearing is much shorter, but of course most lesser agents, what I denote as lesser agents, most of them have a much shorter lifespan than humans, although it takes almost 2 decades to raise a human from child to adulthood, right? As opposed to for other organisms, it's a much shorter time for the organism to go from childhood to adulthood. So one of the biggest setbacks of human behavior is it takes so long in terms of child rearing or proper socialization, because it could take almost 2 decades. for a human to become a functioning member, a fully functioning member of society, right? And like, that's such a big setback. I do point that out in the paper, by the way. It's like, wow, it's like it could take 16 years or longer for a human to become functionally capable member of society and be able to optimize for its fitness with respect to the rest of the population, right? As a functioning member of society. I mean, fundamentally, we still have to engage with each other to survive, right? But child rearing takes such a long time, unfortunately. But getting back to this, generational transference idea and how we get to generalized knowledge, just to kind of go over it a little bit more, is that, we understand this whole generalization of sensations, which leads to prioritizing sensations as information, then prioritizing information as concepts, and then iterations of concepts passed down. If concepts are reinforced long enough through the longevity of a species, right? We consider like all existing agents of a particular category. So if we consider humans as agents, and for however long humans have been around, how long have they been leveraging certain concepts? If certain concepts were passed down to enough generations of humans, then those concepts can be utilized as generalized knowledge. Basically, modes of abstraction that have optimized our behavior in the long run that we know we can rely on, like our life depends on it. That gives us a model of reality that we can rely on. Even though as agents we are cursed to generalize reality, certain ways we conceptualize reality and like come up with ways to means of conceptual mappings that persist long enough over time through enough generations of humans. Like it's as if those concepts are true to the nature of living a long enough lifespan to optimize fitness as a human, right? So like how we cook our food and how we just how we engage, just how we leverage habits at all, like has to do with how we conceptualize information, right? Like how we develop these conceptual mappings that are just consistent through enough passed down generations of humans to us, to our generation of humans. It's so consistent that we can take it for granted. That's what is meant here by generalized knowledge. And I already went over intelligence generalization, but the integrity of our the reason why we're able to engage with the world around us the way we are able to and utilize in the sense of utilizing language and having access and capacities to utilize certain technologies is because enough humans over time cooperate with each other in a collective fashion. And this is just fundamental to our existence because it's what we know to be true in the sense of like how would we, is there any way we would know what life would be like if we didn't have computers, if we didn't have cell phones, if I didn't speak the English language or another language, if I didn't speak any language at all? What if humans couldn't utilize language structure in a sophisticated enough fashion in large enough persistent groups over time, then none of these interactions would be possible. Me recording this Q&A video wouldn't be possible if we just didn't collectively engage with each other. It's just fundamental to being human. And in terms of exploring novelty, there's a lot of problems with what I would say in terms of like how we engage with each other as groups and establish institutions and organizations, like how we manifest group behavior over time in a persistent manner. I mean, that could be problematic because we get so used to engaging with our environment, yet our engagement could deceive us over time, because the way we engage with our environment that we used to benefit so much from could transition to maladaptively, where we start getting penalized for it, right? So I don't have to go into the whole shindig of like, oh well, there's problems with institutions and political shenanigans, right? The whole idea of politics is how we govern groups of humans to engage with each other in the most ethical fashion to preserve each other's agency in the most optimized manner. That has to do largely with, I don't want to say, I guess you could say politics, but I would just say overall, fundamentally, we're constantly, we are always collectively engaging with each other. At least in order to optimize our fitness, we have to cooperate on some level. We have to recognize each other's agency and realize that, hey, like, if I'm going to cooperate with this person, then I have to be mindful of how I engage with this person. That's the bottom line, which is fundamental to our collective capacities to as humans to get as far as we have with developing society and technology. Hopefully that, and in terms of novelty exploration, I guess you could say even right now, there's moments of just given how we collectively engage with our environment and take advantage of the resources in our environment, for better or worse, novelty exploration has to do with how do we optimize everybody's fitness in the long run. If we think about stuff like climate change, which I'm not going to get into that, but, if we think about existential problems with how we engage with each other, right, and how we optimize for that, I just see, there's a lot of problems with how groups engage with each other in conflict resolution, and that could be the downfall of humanity, right? Like, if we just fail to engage with each other in ways that provide enough novel insights to preserve the current, preserve moving forward to having better technological and social capacities, as opposed to social and technological regression, and in the worst case, extinction, right? Like, we can annihilate, humanity can annihilate almost all of itself, right? Maybe not itself entirely. That's highly debatable. I'm not going to say that's necessarily possible, but I think there's a lot of hostility between groups of people, more than there is any conflict resolution. So I try to be hopeful that there is eventually enough novelty that comes around that saves us from ourselves, because how we act collectively is fundamental. Like that's how humanity got as far as it has. Like that's how we have these technologies. Like that's how I'm recording this video. It's like enough of us have been able to cooperate to a sufficiently sophisticated capacity for this to be reality. And if we want to keep going, if we want better technology, we want better agency to engage with each other in the world around us, then we have to optimize for that, right? And it's not necessarily trivial about how we ought to do that, but preserving viability is key in terms of, okay, I as a human have to recognize how I can optimize my mindful engagement with other humans, which means like, hey, like, what can I do to work with this person and let this person know that they should care about my interaction with them, and you know, help. It's like a help me help you situation, right? Like we're in this help me help you situation because we rely on engaging with each other, and ultimately that's what it comes down to. I mean, let's see if there's something. I mean, other than going back to guided random search and making a spiel about exploring novelty, because ultimately novelty exploration has to do with how we uniformly, you know, when we deal with the random aspects of engaging with circumstances, like there's uniformity in what those circumstances present, right? There's no there's no favoritism selection happening where, oh yeah, we should, like, this, it's clear that this is what we should do to optimize our fitness. You know, I mean, if it was, then it wouldn't necessarily be random. On the other hand, this guidedness, right, like prioritizing how we ought to engage with each other, that's, you know, if we don't prioritize some means of cooperation, then, you know, in the face of novelty, then, you know, we're going to be penalized for our fitness instead of having some chance to optimize for our fitness, right? And then the aspect of search, right? So, you know, when we talk about guided random search, and maybe reiterating this again, since the GuestStream video is worth bringing up, because I think it is a bit of an abstract concept, this idea of guided random search. You know, on the one hand, there's this uniformity of engagement, right? On the other hand, there's prioritizing that uniform. You know, okay, well, how am I going to, you know, how do I gain leverage, right? I have to prioritize some way to engage my environment. And then the search is like selecting out certain aspects of engaging with my environment, right? So like I'm selecting out certain means, certain decisions, certain perceptions, certain actions, certain ways to anticipate. And then optimization, right? There's this idea of optimization, right? It's like guided random search optimization. This capacity of optimization has everything to do with clearly optimizing fitness, right? Even though problems with cellular senescence and all that, in the long run, we want to optimize for better rather than worse circumstantial outcomes. So that's the idea of optimization. Let's see if there's anything else here. And I think the ultimate irony due to our capacities of language is we as humans, we fourth wall our own reality. We're aware that we're mortal beings. We're not going to live forever. We have this capacity to play with abstractions in our own heads. We can imagine scenarios that either are realistic or unrealistic. We can explore language in the reality of interactions, or in the imagining sense of what inspires our engagement with reality. But I think that this fourth walling sense is quite this fourth walling aspect is quite interesting for those people who are fans of Deadpool, the anti-hero. I like how he's an interesting character of parodying the fourth walling of how we as humans have fourth walled our own reality in the sense that we have this level of awareness, this degree of autonomy that we develop a meta around our awareness in the sense of being aware not just of our own existence, but that we exist in an environment that we exist in space-time and in a whole universe, and that whole universe, even though we might not be sure of like what the implications of the universe as environment is, it might exist within other a space of other universes that can potentially engage with each other, right? Well, that's not necessarily, that's up to contention, but we know we exist in a universe, and we can abstract about that, right? We can imagine and utilize language to conceptualize the our own awareness and our role in the universe, and this is other agents are not capable of this because they don't have the capacity to develop language structures the way humans have and augment the language structures that they develop. So let's see, what else is in here that I didn't go over? So like we have these technological augmentation capacities that, in the sense that we can keep improving how we engage with our environment and each other, right? We manipulate the resources around us to develop the technologies that we use. That's this idea of extensive technological augmentation capacities due to generalized knowledge. And ultimately, interestingly enough, we have to come to a understanding of what this all really means. And at the end of the day, you could say, well, our capacities as humans to cooperate with each other to such a degree and have gone as far as we have, maybe it's arbitrary, but it's also motivated, and because we decided to cooperate with each other in such a sufficient manner, and that manner should be really symbiotically coordinated. And I guess you could say, to a degree, as far as technology has gotten us, it is to an extent symbiotically coordinated, but the lacking, what is lacking, is how we develop technology in a sense, in respect to how it impacts our ecosystem in which we are existentially bound to. So the real challenge, especially to how we engage with each other collectively in the most optimal fashion, and in terms of novelty exploration and dealing with uncertainty, the real challenge is how do we symbiotically coexist with our ecosystem over time as we try to furthermore augment language capacities and augment our means to leverage technology and cooperate with each other. That's really the real challenge, and in a sense, thinking of the role of human beings, I like to think, given, and there's no true answer to the functional role of human beings per se, but I would argue that the functional role of human beings within the ecosystem is to steward the ecosystem, because we have the degrees of awareness we have due to our sufficient level of cooperation in groups that enabled us to develop augmented language capacities, which then enabled us to develop technologies. And then we come back full circle from that, and we could say it's arbitrary, but I think that is not necessarily correct due to the degrees of autonomy that are enabled from our cooperation with each other, recognizing, abstractly, our own existence, due to our degrees of autonomy, being able to abstract in a conceptual means our own existence within the ecosystem. It gives us some level of accountability that we ought to be accountable to do enough to work with our ecosystem, to preserve the viability of other agents that aren't humans in our ecosystem. And that's another challenge. That's part that, regarding the symbiotic coexistence of humans, is acknowledging that perhaps we are the stewards of our ecosystem, because we are the only agents that within our ecosystem that exist, that have this capacity, and we can annihilate ourselves as well as, to an extent, each other. But at the end of the day, our degrees of autonomy and capacity to be aware as we are of ourselves and our surroundings, begs the question of, should we hold ourselves more accountable for our behavior? And I think we should, but we also should be. We should try to be honest about that, right? We should try to come to terms with what can we do to cooperate with each other. What are our own individual limitations to work collectively with each other? And I think that's the real problem here, and in terms of how we can work together to survive as a species. That is a whole categorization of existing agents that exist within the ecosystem that we are existentially embedded in or bound to. And I'm glad that Michael brought up that question regarding in terms of how a moment of novel individual insight becomes a collective behavior change, and thinking about, how do individuals
engage with their environment as opposed to pairs of individuals and clusters of individuals. It all comes down to really recognizing the agency we have due to how far we've gotten with our capacities to cooperate with each other. And then enough of us realizing what we ought to do. Like, I think it's quite interesting how I've seen a number of recent podcasts and interviews of notable scholars saying that we need to grow up and how we work together. Like all this conflict, especially the geopolitical climate, like we need to grow up, we need to work together, we need to get serious here in how we engage with each other in our surrounding environment, because it really could be a big deal, and it's looking like, based on the consensus of a lot of scholars, that it is a big deal. And I think I mostly provide a lot of nuance to Michael's questions, but what I will say is, in terms of, like, I mean, will we be able to persevere as a species? I mean, I think, it's interesting because a number of scholars also say that we don't really know what's going to happen in the future, but, there's a lot of conflict which could imply that, we might regress socially and technologically as a species in the worst case. I think realistically, due to the lacking capacity of cooperation among enough humans, that novel insight will be far too little to influence collective behavior. Like, if we're considering how individual groups can inspire larger and larger numbers of groups in terms of cooperation, I think that's problematic, and I think that there's a likely chance that we have this regressive we have, like, sort of a regressive cycle, or a process of going through regression before there's a chance of progression. But I could be wrong, my thoughts are, like, we're likely to regress socially and technologically. Who knows how far back we go, but I don't think that the implications are good. I don't know how bad they could be. I try to be hopeful that enough of us will work together in the long run. Realistically, I'm not very optimistic about that, but I think that's what having faith is all about. But I'm not going to talk about what having faith necessarily means. I did make a recent video about that, so you can watch that video. But I think that I think realistically, I think it's best to hope for the best in terms of how we can just collectively engage with each other in an optimal and idealistic manner that benefits most, if not every, human being, considering that there's some human beings that are largely irrational in terms of their behavior and far out there. I'm not going to get into examples specifically, but it is problematic, and I think I went over enough elaboration here. Definitely read the definitely look into, like, for more comprehensive elaboration, definitely read the preprint. Okay, so let me take a sip of water. So I think I answered Michael's questions, but I want to extend that and talk a bit about maladaptive learning, because I only was able to do a quick summary of maladaptive learning, but I want to spend a bit more time elaborating on the extremities of maladaptive learning that leads to addiction. So how much time we have on here? Yeah, it's gonna go over 2 hours. It's been a tough year for me because I've been writing intensively, so I'm not in the best headspace to keep this shorter than over 2 hours. So bear with me here. I don't think it's going to take me more than half an hour to go through the rest of this. I could be wrong. Okay. So, like, we can think of the very extreme maladaptive learning, where we regard error-proneness of interpreting sensations and information that misleads our behavior. And then this persistent manner of misleading and deceiving ourselves, in the worst case, to the extreme, leads to addiction. So, like, this complex, this fixated complex per se of engaging with our environment in a counterintuitive fashion, right, is what we can generalize to be as addiction. So in some manner, like, you know, there's some way we as agents are choosing to engage with our environment for better or worse. We may or may not be aware that we are engaging maladaptively. So we can consider addiction here to be the very extreme of just persistently engaging with our environment in a means which is counterintuitive, but we can't help it, right? And we're doing the same behavior constantly, like it's like oblivious. And on the one hand, we can be aware of that. On the other hand, we might not be aware of that, right? And that has to do with environmental circumstances. So there's this. I guess I didn't go over this well enough during the GuestStream. So there's the PAP-cycle dynamics, and then there's this enveloping of a world model. And the compromise and the world model is, you know, the world model is really how, like, due to perceiving, acting, and anticipating, and just how we develop an abstract representation that's consistent, that updates due to the PAP-cycle dynamics, priors, perceptions, actions, and priors, right? And when this becomes compromised, it's, you know, this compromise to an extreme is vulnerable to addictive behavior, right? And okay, so what would be most interesting then to lead into is, okay, well, the agent's capacity to optimize fitness goes awry, right? It's compromised, and then this leads to maladaptive behavior or maladaptive learning. and obliviously persistent complexes of behaviors which are counterintuitive to the agent's fitness, we consider these behaviors to be addiction. And now, okay, well, the extremities of maladaptive learning behavior is due to what I like to call the 5 fatal tendencies. So these 5 fatal tendencies are hedonistic behavior, narcissistic behavior, masochistic behavior, sadistic behavior, and nihilistic tendencies. We'll call them tendencies. And maladaptive behaviors can be a mishmash or of these tendencies or traits, right? So there can be a exceeding amount of self and of pleasure, this experience of pleasure or indulgence of a behavior. On the other hand, there can be, as the agent engages with the world around them, like if we think of masochistic behavior, is like the agent is constantly penalizing itself. And sadistic behavior has to do with the agent, wanting to penalize other agents, or persistently penalizing other agents in an exceeding fashion. And nihilistic would have to do with the lack of direction. Like there's a lack of incentive for the agent to engage with their environment. So nihilism has to do with meaning, or this sense of intentionality. That is there intent for the agent to engage with their surroundings in such a way. So these 5, so the mishmash thereof of these 5 tendencies, that is hedonism, narcissism, masochism, sadism, and nihilism, has much to do with how how the extremity of maladaptive behavior plays out, whether or not that the agent thereof becomes vulnerable at all to being to addictions. So I do a lot of mentioning about inter-agent dynamics and how we engage with each other, and I think that's pretty intuitive to go off of, even though I kind of go, I don't spend that much time going off about it, I don't think. So, okay, what's more interesting than maladaptive learning has to do with how do we deal with it? How do we recognize how to deal with compromising behaviors that compromise our fitness, right? Because that's obviously more fitness than generalizing what does it mean for an organism to penalize its own fitness, even though understanding that more precisely based on circumstances is interesting, and it may help us come to resolutions to reinforcing fitness. What we should understand in terms of addictions is furthermore, it's probably intuitive to classify different types of addictions, right? Like different complexes of behaviors in terms of the proneness of how an agent becomes oblivious to their fitness, right? And we categorize these as transdiagnostic phenotypes, as mentioned in the literature. And then these represent categories of addiction. So addictions, as I present in my paper, I think this is a good elaboration here. Addictions are compulsive outbursts of maladaptive behavior which can be traced back to traumatic as well as physiological compromise of the agent in question regarding their incapacity to regulate reinforcement-based behavior to leverage fitness rather than continually incur fitness penalties. So, and this is what I mean by the agent being oblivious to their fitness, is that their capacity to perceive, act, and anticipate with regard to their world model updating is compromised, right? That the agent has went through enough traumatic experiences, enough trauma, or there's some physiological issues that the agent deals with, and where they can't help but engage with the world around them in a way that is persistently oblivious to their fitness. So it has to be both here, right? Because it wouldn't make sense for an agent to deal with addiction due to physiological compromise. Like, they have to have had exposure to a certain stimulus which enabled them to be drawn towards persisting with their environment in a certain way. So trauma plays a huge role here. So the way, let's see how I define trauma. Otherwise, I'm just... Alright. So the way trauma manifests, it has to do with this idea of hypervigilance. In the GuestStream, I went over hyper and hypovigilant. Hyper and hypo sensitivity. So agents overcompensate how they engage with their environment, and in regards to how they generalize sensations and information, right? So there's this oversensitive processing of stimuli, this overgeneralization of sensations, or rather overcompensation of generalizations of sensations, and this leads to this persists chronically, leading from hyperarousal difficulties, right? And this is really what's leading to addictive behaviors, is this constant persistence to leaning towards a certain mode of engagement that is penalizing the fitness of an agent, and the agent is constantly over prioritizing and they're hyper aroused by a certain mode of engagement which is counterintuitive to their fitness, and they may or may not know that they're being oblivious to their fitness, right? And it's important to make a recollection here that this is risky behavior, right? This is, penalizing fitness is risky in the long term and the short term. But risk-taking behavior is not necessarily maladaptive in its inherent nature, as there are moments agents must leverage fitness associated with marginal risk, especially when dealing with moments of uncertainty. Additionally, we recall gambling on fitness associated with marginal risk where there is anticipatory intent behind trade-offs in how agents optimally engage with each other as well as their environment, and in turn leveraging their fitness or self-sustenance while also leveraging environmental constraints both intrinsically and extrinsically. And furthermore, we recall that agents can choose to be selectively oblivious towards modes of deterrence while anticipating trade-offs for short-term or long-term fitness gains, varying based on environmental constraints. These trade-offs involve varying fitness gambles with marginal risk of incurring penalties while anticipating leverage to pan out based on unraveling circumstantial moments over time. Compromise in which the agent in question fails to discern when and how they ought to neglect effective modes of deterrence for a period of time in order to leverage anticipatory trade-offs certainly leads to proneness and maladaptive learning of varying extremities, often leading to what is commonly known as addiction. However, there can be times where agents are not consciously oblivious to modes of deterrence, potentially leading to compromise, likewise with regard to complication in assessing anticipatory trade-offs, leading to proneness in maladaptive learning of varying extremities, which also can lead to addictive behavior. So we mentioned the capacity of categorizing, addictions to be each categorization is a transdiagnostic phenotype as denoted by the literature. And let's see what else I should say. So, addictions are, as I mentioned, these compulsive outbursts of maladaptive behavior which can be traced back to traumatic as well as physiological compromise of the agent in question regarding their incapacity to regulate reinforcement-based behavior to leverage fitness rather than continually incur fitness penalties. Such continual incurring of fitness penalties is enabled by the agent in question, perhaps until a means to replace the addiction by substituting it with some composition of reinforcement learning behaviors to take its place. So this might not necessarily be the necessary solution, but means to substitutionally channel a composition of behaviors for other behaviors in their place is one means to deal with addiction, and we see this with people who are familiar with recovery programs and how they work. Substitutional channeling is like being exposed to a community of peers and maybe even develop, being open-minded to other possible ways of engaging with the world around us, which might not be motivated by going through a recovery program, but having the willpower and the conviction to realize that there's a certain way I'm engaging with the world around me that is counterintuitive to an extreme, that it's really bad for my fitness, and in the long run it's just it's really going to weigh me down, and I ought to do something about it before I regret it. So finding a means to, okay, I need a way to substitute this behavior or composition of behaviors thereof with something more reinforcement based. And so I don't know, it could be finding a new hobby, or deciding to embark on a lifelong journey of developing a skill set or something, right? Some means of channeling how we engage with the world around us more intuitively than previously is a means to channel this idea of channeling how we engage intrinsically and extrinsically with our environment. It is fundamental to this idea of really what is a recalibration of engaging with stimuli, right? So that's ultimately what's happening here. And this has to do with attentional dynamics, like how we are focusing our attention and prioritizing our engagement, rather, with our surroundings, both intrinsically and extrinsically speaking. So there's more I could say on this. Like I don't think getting too much more into it is that necessary. Again, like I said, if you want more insight on this, I think I gave a good, in terms of substituting a a composition of behaviors with another composition of behaviors thereof. It should seem intuitive enough. And like this sense of recalibrating how we engage with the world around us is really what's happening with substituting this substitutional channeling of behaviors. So we talked about cognitive strain, but we didn't talk about the magnitude and amplification of extremes that has to do with cognitive load balancing of stress management. Because this is really what is leading. This is how trauma manifests. Because trauma has to do with exposure dynamics and how those exposure dynamics of the environment is influencing the agent to engage with stimuli in a way that compromises their world modeling and their capacity to perceive, act, and anticipate, because they overcompensate certain sensations within their environment that they're being certain stimuli in their environment that they're exposed to over time. And like this hyper-vigilant resulting behavior that arises, leads to this, what this is as prolonged what we consider to be prolonged exposure to chronic stress that manifests as trauma. And then like this prolonged trauma manifestation, and really prolonged chronic stress, fundamentally, is what leads to cognitive strain. So like I was talking about, okay, well, imagine if I took if I took a stick, right? Let's think about associating cognitive strain with like how I apply force to an object that doesn't take that much effort to manipulate. And I could take a stick, right? I could take a very I could take a stick and I can apply pressure to the stick. And if I apply enough pressure, it breaks in half, right? Because it's, I'm applying enough force that deforms the integrity of the stick to maintain its form. And we can think about that, the stress I'm applying, like if I apply enough stress that it deforms the stick, even if it doesn't break in half, that deformity we can think of as strain. And the breaking in half of the stick is like the exceeding force, like that enabled me to break the stick in half. So cognitive strain here is the result of what manifests as trauma, right? There's this prolonged exposure to stress, and trauma results as this development of what becomes cognitive load straining, right? Because there's this incapacity to effectively load balance cognitive load itself, that there's this manifestation of strain. There's this strenuous overhaul. There's this cognitive load overhaul, right? So cognitive strain emphasizes leaning towards edge of cognitive overhaul. Now, magnitude represents, so the magnitude of cognitive strain represents the amount of overload, while the amplification would be the moments of additional exceeding load amounted to such magnitude in question unsatisfactorily addressed. Now, there's a couple interesting remarks I want to make about cognitive strain before I move on. One is that Bessel van der Kolk came out with this text called "The Body Keeps the Score," and I think I also believe that's a good way of putting what cognitive strain means, is how the body literally keeps the score in terms of like the amount of stress, the amount of overexposure to stimulus that is not satisfactorily addressed to the point that it exceeds cognitive load. It exceeds, it strains cognitive load as well as bodily load. And additionally, I don't think much literature really pays attention to this conceptualization of cognitive strain. And that's problematic. let's see here. Okay, there's not much more left. How far are we? Oof, 2.5 hours. I called 2 hours, so it's half an hour off. Okay. So there's this interesting model of understanding that helps helps with making sense of cognitive strain, and I think that Mo Godot, I think it's Mo Godot, right? Yeah, and he was the former chief business officer of Google X, and he came up with what is known as the TON model: trauma, obsession, noise, and nuisances. So we talked about trauma being this prolonged exposure, this manifestation of cognitive of what results as cognitive strain load as prolonged exposure to stressors, right? That puts the agent at the edge of cognitive overhaul. I believe that's how I the sheer magnitude and amplification of cognitive strain, which is prolonged and chronically induced, can be associated with degrees of trauma manifestation in and of itself. Just wanted to make sure that I found a nice definition to reference for that, but I think the wording I came up with also pretty much mapped out to that. So again, the sheer magnitude and amplification of cognitive strain, which is prolonged and chronically induced, can be associated with degrees of trauma manifestation. Right? And we go back to the TON model here. So what is the TON model? Why is that interesting? Okay, well, T represents trauma, O represents obsessions, and we can think of obsessions as the overvaluation, the potential overvaluation and hyperfixation, which stress can complicate habitual behavior due to hyperarousal compromise of PAP-cycle dynamics and world modeling. Nuisances consider the overhauling of stressors permeating cognitive strain, in which relative repeat exposure and load handling, as well as moderately persistent, generally minimally bothersome stimuli, may lead an agent to their tipping point of cognitive strain, likely resulting in burnout or experience of psychosis thereof as the worst case outcome. Noise considers the bombardment of additional non-priority stimulus, which can also be minimally bothersome to the agent in question, although not as triggering as nuisances due to noise being less persistently prominent as a trigger for exceeding the tipping point of strain overload. So we can think of obsessions, they're kind of like a double-edged sword, right? Because obsessions, we can think of them as motivating the agent to direct themselves accordingly in a manner which can be reinforcing. On the other hand, and that's if they align with the agent's fitness. Otherwise, obsessions may compromise the agent into acting maladaptively. So, largely abnormal hyperfixating with regard to overvaluation of pursuing specific behaviors leads an agent to behave maladaptively in such a manner of ongoing obsession, thereby leading to behaviors that are counterintuitive to fitness. Maladaptive behavior formative of obsession then likely incurs fitness penalties of varying complication due to the circumstances and disposition of the agent in question, as well as complicating the magnitude and amplification of cognitive strain with respect to degrees of trauma. So, nuisances present themselves as permeating, somewhat predictable, yet also slightly persistent, but also triggering to the agent in question. They can be somewhat predictable, yet also slightly persistent, but also trigger. Let's see. Okay, they can come and go as pervading generally non-priority extraneous stimuli loads that tend to be minimally bothersome and marginally disrupting to how the agent in question prioritizes inherently unique goals with respect to other agents. Nuisances could also pertain to prioritize aspects of the agent's goals in terms of certain procedures which pose as mildly bothersome stressors due to annoyances inherent in the procedures being carried out to accomplish task loads oriented to uniqueness of goals thereof. In contrast to noise, nuisances are related in some capacity to the agent in question in the event they are likely to be triggering, as well as identify as a nuisance to the agent in question as opposed to being noise. Where a nuisance relates in some capacity uniquely to the agent's world modeling and goal orientation in terms of repeated enough exposure to a stimulus to be deemed a potential nuisance in the first place. With regard to nuisances as opposed to noise, degrees of improperly addressed trauma manifest as means in which a nuisance itself complicates by association as a trigger with respect to how such complication magnifies and amplifies cognitive strain. Noise pertains to extraneous non-priority stimulus presented to the agent in question, regardless of their capacity to prioritize tasks with respect to goal orientation. In some cases, noise interpreted by one agent can be interpreted as meaningful stimuli to another. In general, noise is an obfuscating stimulus load or loads thereof that is marginally disruptive to the attentional dynamics of an agent's relative assessment and evaluation of goals with respect to task prioritization. Generally, noise manifests as arbitrary obfuscating stimuli loads. There is a chance for noise to become more persistent as well as oblivious to the agent's capacity to prioritize tasks with respect to goal orientation and transition into a nuisance for the agent in question. So, we're almost done here. So, in terms of what can result from addictive behaviors is problems with the psychological associations of an agent, right? So, this can get into categorizing psychological traits of agents at extremes in terms of disorderly conduct. And this, even I do make reference to the DSM-5, but there is also the ICD-11, I believe it is. So, referring to the DSM-5 manual or the ICD-11 relates to the categorization of pathologies that where there's this, that can be correlated to addictions or reasons for why addictive behaviors arise. There can be correlation with the pathologies of the psyche of the agent. And in the unfortunate case, there can be category errors regarding making the right correlations. So misdiagnosing a pathology, it would be regarded as a category error. I'm not going to spend much time explaining that. And then lastly, there's active learning and consumption learning with respect to understanding addictive behavior. So actively, and I might have glanced over this in the GuestStream, but just to do a quick, I don't think I have to spend too much time on active learning versus consumption learning. Active learning has to do with the agent's constructive engagement with their environment, while consumption learning is a bit more complicated in the sense that, on the one hand, an agent can just arbitrarily engage with their environment, and it means that it doesn't quite benefit them, but it doesn't really penalize them either. But if there's exceeding consumption, if there's this exceeding engagement that's not necessarily constructive to the agent, then it could penalize the fitness of the agent, right? So consumption learning, we can generalize that consumption is synonymous in a sense with addiction, where the extremity of proneness to addictive behavior is this constant, persisting engagement in a certain means with the environment, where an agent is constantly obliviously incurring fitness penalties, right? So while active learning deals with the constructive engagement with the environment that optimizes fitness, consumption learning, on the one hand, if there's this arbitrary engagement that doesn't really benefit the agent at all, but doesn't penalize the agent, it's still consumption learning, but it's not at the point where it's maladaptive learning behavior. It's maladaptive learning behavior when it starts penalizing the agent's fitness. Okay. So I think that's pretty much everything that I wanted to go over. I did a quick overview of free will. I'm not going to do it again. I already went 2.5 hours longer. I already went over half an hour longer than I wanted to, but thank you for watching, and I hope I addressed the question, the concerns Daniel brought up, and I also hope that I addressed the 2 questions that Michael brought up quite well. Thank you for your time.